Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you in this new conversation of 30 Minutes with. Today, we are going to discuss transnational feminisms, and our guest is someone who has extensively written on the topic. Welcome, Zahra Ali. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So I would like to introduce you very briefly to the people who are listening to us. So Zara is a sociologist and an assistant professor at Rutgers University in Newark. Her research explores dynamics of women and gender, social and political movements in relation to Islam, the Middle East, and context of war and conflict with a focus on contemporary Iraq. She is interested in empire, racial capitalism, post-coloniality, transnational feminism, as well as critical knowledge production and epistemologies. Ali Zahra is the author of Féminisme Islamique 2012, published by 2012 by La Fabrique, Women and Gender in Iraq, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, and the co-author of Decolonial Pluriversalism, Roman and Litfield, Creolizing the Canon series with Sunya Diane Hersbrom. So I'm just trying to pronounce her name right. And finally, Zahra is a co-author of the book Gagner le Monde. What's the subtitle of the book? Quelques héritages féministes.
Yes.
Has been published by La Fabrique in 2023. Zahra, thank you so much. So in the preparation of this conversation, you said something that really hits home when you said that your work is about trying to theorize from and not about Iraq. Can you please tell us more? Because I think this is really interesting, a really interesting premise to theorizing transnational feminism.
Thank you so much, Rama. So there's so much to say about that. This is so central in my thinking, the idea of what is theory? Who is it for?
Exactly.
Who is it for? Whose interest does it serve? Right? It's also a very famous this book called Decolonizing Epistemologies, invite us by the famous decolonial feminist Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. She talks about research and she asks this question: whose research is it? Whose interest does it serve? And she relates it to the ways in which people have been researching indigenous communities, like white people. Exactly. White middle-class people have been researching indigenous communities, and she's trying to think about ways in which people can reappropriate their own research agenda and also bring up their own approach, their own perspective on what theory is. So I've been thinking about it because, I started writing on Iraq. I was living in Iraq. Iraq is where I'm from. It's been more than a decade now that I have been working with and on social movement, feminist activism, especially in Baghdad, but also in other parts of Iraq. And I started writing about Iraq kind of as a reaction in some ways to the incredible amount of literature, whether it's like mostly policy-oriented literature in English, talking about Iraq as if Iraq is a thing. Exactly. It is the backdrop of a conversation that is actually happening elsewhere. It's all about US foreign policy. It's all about what Iraq means for US people, scholars, agenda. And so Iraq is that thing, and it's never really about Iraqis themselves. They're never really centered. Their everyday life, their everyday realities. And so when I started writing about Iraq, about feminist movement, I was working with feminists in Baghdad, organizing with them. I also wanted to break with this literature that is also answering the empire. Everything is about the empire. As much as, that was a challenge, because as much as I was talking about, and I was also trying to explain and analyze what does it mean to be an Iraqi feminist, to be a woman as well, living after the US invasion and occupation? What's the everyday life in Baghdad? What does it mean to organize a protest in Baghdad after the invasion and occupation? And I tried to bring complexity in the analysis of that, and not to get stuck in just answering the empire, but really center Iraqi women and feminist subjectivities and experiences, right? And I'm trying to do that as well because, I mean, this is not a movement that I've necessarily participated in, but I have observed. I am working right now on a book that analyzed the Iraqi October 2019 uprising, which is the biggest uprising that has happened in Iraq's contemporary history. That demanded the end of the post-2003 regime, that demanded justice, equality, redistribution of resources. And that movement was led by young people, poor people. And one of my arguments is to say that the massive participation of women turned this uprising, turned this wave of protest, because we had so many waves of protest in Iraq in the last decade, into an uprising. And the title of my forthcoming book is Intifada. And Intifada, because in Arabic, actually, the inti means the you in feminine. So I insist on the inti in the Intifada. So the term means literally uprising, right? And so for me, I make this kind of argument, which is centering the subjectivities, centering the experiences, the body experiences, the affect as well, of people whose life has been defined by, racial colonialism, extractivism, whose everyday life, Iraq is a space that has been brutalized in the past few decades. From authoritarian violence to imperial violence to military violence to the violence of extractivism, because of course Iraq is central in the military oil complex that dominates the systems of power of the world in which we live in. And so Iraqis themselves, especially poor Iraqis, especially Iraqis who do not agree with what happened after 2003 and who have risen against the regime that was put in place by the Americans in 2003, their life is definitely considered disposable.
Exactly.
Especially actually Iraqi men, young Iraqi men. And so I'm saying different things. I'm saying that, first of all, placing the experiences, the affect, the subjectivities, the bodies of this group of people whose life is considered disposable, so easily erased by the systems of power that dominate our world, is to expand our theoretical imagination, our feminist imagination as well, our political imagination, beyond the kind of wide middle classness that constitutes the center of the debate on, for example, climate change or the future of life in this world. So centering the lives of those whose life is not even considered of any value, right? So that's kind of a level of my argument here. Another level is, I make this claim that actually, if you want to decolonize hegemonic feminism, especially in the West, I mean, of course, especially when we think of white feminism, actually placing the subjectivities and just recognizing the humanity of Arab men, Iraqi men, Afghani men, Palestinian men, the men of Gaza, right? And not falling into only a discourse about women and children, which has been critiqued by feminists, right? For decades.
Poor women and children.
Exactly. Is actually a very important way to decolonize feminism and to really reconsider whose life is valuable, whose life is not valuable. And so my transnational feminism is to kind of propose to see theory from a different lens, right? I mean, we know that radical feminist theory is to question women as the subject of feminism. My transnational feminism is to consider that instead of seeing the world as actually, when it comes to the Middle East, to Iraq, to what the Muslim majority world as it is commonly defined, mostly people see differences through the lens of culture. What I'm trying to say is that it's not about culture. Culture is actually a homogeneous term, a very problematic term that has been imposed on our region, right? It doesn't mean anything, and we should actually not even use it at this point. But actually, the difference is that we are situated differently within the systems of power that structure the contemporary world in which we live in. So let's say that some people, including some women as well, benefit from the systems of power.
Exactly.
And some people, and actually they can be men, they can be women, they actually, the systems of power actually, they are paying the price, they are victims of these systems of power, but also the systems of power actually, they are carrying these systems on their shoulders. They are the working class, they are the people who are actually whose life has been defined by the brutal extractivism that fuel the systems of power. So I'm trying to really shift here the understanding. So the trans actually in transnational is very central for me, the term trans, because it breaks with international feminism. We're sick of international feminism. We're sick of this global feminism and women of the world. That is something that I mean, there's a decade of work that critique it. But also the trans in the sense that we want to transcend borders of nation. I mean, I'm not seeing Iraq as a nation state. I mean, of course, the nation state, especially when it's post-colonial and when it has been under attack, has its importance. However, I think beyond actually, and the whole point of the trans is to challenge borders of nation, borders of sexualities as well, and also to think of a feminism that center the integrity of the body. And I think that one of the difficulties that we have been having is either we fall into a very simplistic anti-imperialism that is quite old at this point, without looking at the different dimensions that structure the systems of power of the world in which we live in which fascism, different kinds of fascism and authoritarianism play a role and need to be really analyzed and dismantled, right? So either it's like white feminism. So the transnational feminism that I'm advocating for is really centering the subjectivities of those who are never part of the equation, never part of the conversation, right?
Thank you so much, Zahra, for this really enlightening response. And if I may cite you, in the book Gagner le monde, quelques héritages féministes, you say, by transnational feminism, I mean breaking with the idea of a here and a there, corresponding to an imagined geography that feeds hegemonic feminisms of the North. Read among white or civilized whites. Women have rights, not like over there. So you, in doing that, in interrogating international feminism and proposing rather to analyze feminism through a transnational lens, you invite us also to deconstruct dichotomies that are based in Western ideology. For instance, the here and the there, the global South, the global North, but also situating and centering, as you just said, bodies, experiences, and spaces that are at the margins or theorized as being at the margins, therefore impossible. So how, what does it do? Does it bring back the politics of feminism to replace, to interrogate the dichotomies here and there, private and public, religious and laic, or secular, to use the English concept? What do you do what do you aim to do when you interrogate these dichotomies?
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to do, so thank you so much for pointing this out, because this is very important in my thinking, like to break with these dichotomies. I mean, so to give an example, the secular versus religious is is this dichotomy is so central in feminist theory, in feminist thinking about, especially about the Middle East or about Muslims or about the Arab worlds. This idea that, you know, you can kind of divide activism or people and their beliefs. So there are the religious are bad, and there are the secular, and the secular are progressive. And I show in my book, Women and Gender in Iraq, really in detail how this is an empty signifier, right? In the sense that it actually doesn't mean anything, and it's not productive even in terms of like meaning. It doesn't produce any meaning because people's life are much more complex than that. But also because in the case, more specifically in the case of Iraq, I mean, of course, there is the US-led invasion occupation. The US forces brought to power in 2003 the most conservative, the most reactionary, the most sectarian political groups that you could ever think of. But that, however, actually, these groups have their own kind of version of heteropatriarchy, but that in a society that has been through decades and decades of militarization, there are other forms of heteropatriarchy that also dominates and that are part of like the social life that cannot really be defined like through this idea of like secular. So there are secular forms of heteropatriarchy and religious forms of heteropatriarchy, and that actually feminists on the ground have understood that very well and have developed strategies to actually fight for women's rights that don't fall into this secular religious dichotomy. So that's one aspect. Something also very important was to break with the dichotomy material versus discursive. And what I tried to do in my thinking and kind of the research also is to, so I basically use the mantra, the feminist mantra, the personal is political, analytically. So in the sense that what I say is that how do you apply it analytically, almost like methodologically, right? As a researcher, as an ethnographer, as a sociologist, is that there's so much emphasis in the literature about Iraq, about the Middle East, on discourses, especially Islamist discourses. So what is women's rights from the point of view of Islamists? And there's so many research where people like sit with people and interview them, say, what is women's rights for you? You know, what does Islam mean to you? And I say that this is really empty, and that if you do not actually look at the level of everyday life and also let the categories kind of emerge from this, the materiality of the space, the affect, the interaction, the relationship that people build in the everyday life, then you really miss the point of what anything means to anybody. So the personal is political applied analytically is really focusing on the level of the everyday, right? And understanding people at this level. And then you have other things emerging, you have other concerns emerging. And actually, what I'm arguing as well, kind of as a feminist methodology, is that it is in the everyday that you actually understand how the world function, right? So if you think of where do you get water, where do you get food, where do you get healthcare, where do you go when you want to give birth, what's your kind of how, like, what is your commute from your house to work or from your house to the house of your relative, then you understand the infrastructural dimension of life. And you know, life in this world actually requires infrastructures. And this idea of infrastructures for me is very, very central in my thinking, because, and this is when, for example, I think with this idea of necropolitics, but I also think that necropolitics is kind of too hegemonous of a term that encompasses like too much. And I try to talk about forces of life and forces of death, right? And then when you look at infrastructures, and we see that today, in Senegal, in Haiti, in Latin America, in the Middle East, it's all about infrastructures. It's all about I mean, for us in Iraq, our infrastructures have been destroyed through decades of war and a decade of sanctions. So nothing actually worked. The electricity doesn't work. The water, the sewage system doesn't work. And so looking at it, you know, from like this is from looking at the lack of infrastructure, then I understand who has access to infrastructures. Well, who and what kind of systems make it possible for people to live in an urban space where they have access to infrastructures and where the infrastructures work? And how come that the rest of the world doesn't have this access to infrastructure? And we realize that actually wars are also infrastructural wars, right? I mean, in Gaza, for example, not only Israel has destroyed, has killed, assassinated thousands of people, but it has also destroyed the infrastructural element that make it even possible to live in Gaza, to continue to live a dignified life, to live just a life, right? And so I look at it and theorize it as forces of death, right? The infrastructural collapse are everyday forces of death. Like when you have electricity cut, internet cut like 10 times a day, what kind of work, what kind of activism, what kind of everyday life, you know, can you have, right? And really middle classness in the world is very much about services and infrastructure.
Exactly.
So that's kind of a very sociological, concrete way in which I apply these categories in my thinking and in my research.
Thank you so much, Zara. I think your response is so important because centering ethnographic or auto-ethnographic methods is what allows us to do that work. And I want to cite in reference, in relation to what you just said about, you know, the labor of death and the labor of life, keeping things alive. There is a book that I read recently, written by radical Palestinian feminists. One woman that was interviewed said that we need to center care and social reproduction because we need to be more and more interested in the labor of making a dead place alive. So I cite her. She says the idea of, she wanted to create a women's center. The idea of the women's center is to make a dead place alive again. And it will be a place for friends to stay, for studying, and a meeting place, you know. And when we read further works about women organizing the resistance economy, I think all that you just said resonates so well, you know, focusing on the everyday practices of resisting. Childcare centers are mobilizing instrument, politicizing domesticity. What do you do when electricity is not working, when you don't have infrastructures to keep people alive? And when those very infrastructures are the very target of, you know, genocidal states such as Israel. So I wanted to know, what is the place of racial capitalism in this thinking? How do you theorize transnational feminism with racial capitalism in mind?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's not so. There's different categories here. So I feel, for example, thinking about colonialism, you know, is a racial project. Has been a racial project. So, and let's say that it's interesting because I'm thinking through the category race and the category empire, right? And so there is, I think, a lot of US centeredness in thinking about race that has been kind of repeated over and over again. It's a little bit like intersectionality. I mean, intersectionality nowadays has become almost, I don't know, a term like what? Yeah, and also it's depoliticized, and it's also used. I think it's important to always relate notions and categories to the history. And I mean, you cannot disentangle intersectionality from Black feminism and you know, Black feminism in the US, right? And so but then how do you use these categories, these tools of thinking in other contexts without falling into being US centered and without falling into imposing, US made categories into other contexts, right? And I think that, so race for me is important, but I'm trying to also come up with an understanding of it that is not US centered. So, and so even when I think about, for example, Blackness in Iraq, which is the reality, we have a huge Afro-Iraqi community that, is very old, that predates the modern state, right? That predates actually the rise of actually modern racial patriarchal capitalism, right? So then how do you theorize it without falling into, I mean, if you look at, for example, the literature that exists on Black people in Iraq, actually, you will see testimonies of US Black soldiers in the city of Basra, seeing all the Black people, and they have never thought that actually Iraqis could be Black, right?
Exactly.
And in some way, it is problematic too, because it's always going to be through the lens of the military, right? So how do you use this category of race, in context where the history of it, the way it is not necessarily articulated with the history of the US. That is a very recent history, right? So I try to kind of bring complexity to the ways in which we use race in a context such as Iraq.
And maybe even propose other categories that may be more relevant for the context of studying than race.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is relevant, though. I do think it is relevant because at the level of the world, I think that we are in Iraq experiencing racial, patriarchal, colonial, capitalist extractivism, right? And that it has a certain, version that, but this is what we are experiencing. It is racial colonial violence. However, I do think that the category empire, and this is when I think imperialism becomes, when it's not used in a simplistic term, is super useful because in some ways, I think that thinking through empire and imperialism allows us to think through structures of power. So we realize, for example, that, the US empire, especially as a military force, as a military power, as the biggest military power in the world, dominates the world in which we live in. But it also allows us to understand, Russian imperialism. It also allows us to understand other forms of hegemonic, fascist hegemonic forces in the region as well, that also play a role in the everyday oppression that Iraqis are experiencing, right? So I think it's a much more dynamic way of understanding that. Again, I always go back to being as centered, in the everyday life of Iraqis, and rather than applying these categories the way it is often done when it comes to Iraq and the Middle East, because it's so easy to say, oh, Iraq is just the US empire, like bloodshed, and it's all about the US. And of course, the US defines, and dominates it brutally. And we've seen that with its support of Israel. It's a brutal support of, what it's considered as an ally in keeping the systems of power, of racial capitalism going. It is also about capitalism, what's happening in Gaza. And it is kind of the most like frontal and direct form of racial colonial violence, right? And at the same time, we're able to say, if we look at the everyday life of people in Iraq, that there are also a lot of other aspects that also is central in the everyday inequalities, oppression that people are experiencing, including, for example, the importance that Iran plays in Iraq's economy, in Iraq's political life, and also in the repression of protest in Iraq.
Thank you so much, Zahra, for this clarification. I think there are two recent books that I've read. One recent book, the other one is, a follow-up from the first. So
Mm,
Christopher J. Lee wrote a book about empire and how to make wealth after empire. And
mm,
Adam Getasho, I don't know if you know her, also wrote a book, Adam Getasho, and it is world making after empire. So their
mhm,
two books talk to each other. So
mm,
when you see, can we talk about solidarity now? When you
mhm,
see South Africa's response,
mm,
seizing the International Court of Justice in order to seek justice and reparation for
mm.
Palestine, what hope do you have in this world making after empire? Like, we are still in the imperial moment,
Yeah,
but how
absolutely.
can we, within that moment,
Mhm,
know, foresee, forecast, but also plan and conspire for that after empire moment? And
mhm.
taking examples from other countries such as South Africa, who are leading from the South.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
What lessons does it give you, or what hopes does it give you for Iraq
Mm,
and more broadly for Palestine and Sudan, Haiti, and so on?
yeah. I mean, what South Africa did, and I mean, so beautifully, and I don't think that anybody could have done it in the way South Africa did it. This case at the ICG, it's just, I mean, the way that they also situated in, they really started in 1948, and they
Mhm,
talked about settler colonial violence, and they really brought it up in the best way you can. They really,
imagine.
the way they defended their case
Mhm.
was incredible.
And their
Really,
minister
really.
is just so powerful, like Naledi Pandor, so inspiring.
She is definitely incredible. It definitely gives me hope. It gives me the hope that I have is actually in people, not
Mhm,
so much in regimes, not so much in political elites.
mhm,
I actually have learned to always be, you know, a little bit distant from political elites. I mean,
mhm,
of course, we need political elites. I understand that. We need parties. We need prime ministers that are, super courageous. I
mhm,
hear that in Senegal, for example, there's new leadership, and I'm hopeful when I hear, certain new leadership.
mhm,
However, I do believe that as feminists, as intellectuals as well, we can afford to
mhm,
always stay critical of,
mhm,
whoever is at, represent, a regime or a state.
mhm,
And where I see something that is lacking, and I feel that there's kind of something emerging with the movement for Palestine, for
mhm,
justice in Palestine, which
mhm,
is connection between movements, understanding. And I think it's been happening, for example, in the US now. I realize that, talking about Palestine, mobilizing for Palestine has opened also discussions about Congo, about Sudan,
mhm,
about Iraq, right? About
mhm,
Afghanistan. So there's an impulse in building these connections between people
mhm,
who understand that they have common interest in coming together, for, and also I think it's it does push us to expand our imagination. We thought that transnational activism was an old thing, and now we realize that actually it is very much something real when people come together, like, because Palestine represents so much for everybody in the global south, right?
mhm,
Palestine is like situated at the heart of the systems of power that oppress us all, right? And we understand it very,
mhm.
very clearly. The Western hypocrisy, like making this statement on Ukraine, and then,
The fact
totally.
that the team, making it for Ukraine, not for Palestinian.
Exactly, exactly. And I think we feel it, like, even in our guts. And I think this gives me hope. This really gives me hope, but I'm still insisting on, people. Actually, when you realize, you see, when people do, like, actions, like, individually, like people raising money individually, people, like, taking to the street, making their own banners, and, like,
Sharing information, organizing the
yeah,
best.
defining the political on their own terms, because I'm always very, very careful and very, I mean, suspicious of these like big political narratives that are sometimes very anachronistic, you know, or these big parties that we, you know, of course, party politics is important. I'm not being like totally like thinking
Yes.
from the moon, you know. However, I think that centering, you know, people's and the way they redefine, and we have seen it, you know,
Mhm.
throughout the
Mhm.
region and the world in 2019. 2019 was the year of uprisings all over the world, you know,
Mhm.
from Iraq to, you know, the entire region to the entire world. And so we see that actually people are taking to the streets and defining the political on their own terms. And I
Mhm.
think that is very, very beautiful. And we need to continue imagining and creating space like this space, us talking,
Mhm.
like we need to continue creating spaces where we can really imagine
Mhm.
a different world
Mhm.
and define the political on our own terms.
Thank you so much. I think that is really important. And in your work, you try always to center women and the poor. And while discussing with feminist activists in Baghdad, but also many other southern Iraq, cities,
Mhm.
Najaf, Kufa, Karbala,
Mhm. Mhm.
Nasiriyah, and Basra, you always try to center the voices of those who are not at the center of the work that we're doing. So if you were, because I think many younger academics,
Mhm.
students are listening to us, most of them want to be decolonial
Mhm.
scholar activist, because I think it's really important to articulate scholarship with activism, because
Mhm.
we evolve, like academia is a tiny parcel of where we spend most of our time.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So what advice would you have if you were to provide three main advice or recommendation, or just sharing based on your experience uh, to students, researchers, feminist researchers who are interested in centering the voices of those whom we don't hear often, in order to be, in order to and want to be decolonial?
Mhm.
What advice would you give them, and what caution uh, would you offer them?
It's difficult to kind of break it down into advice, but the thing is,
Yeah,
it also depends who though, because
exactly.
I have so many like I don't know white middle class students who come to me and they're like, I want to talk about Iraq, I want to do research in Iraq. I'm like, are you the best person to do that? Like, ask
Mhm.
yourself. So if you want to write, you know, about something, maybe stay as close, you know, as close as, you know, an experience. I mean, I also don't want to say that you cannot write about some context that is not yours. I don't think so. I think this is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. I think it's always about how you engage.
Mhm.
So how can you be the least extract like
Attractive.
how can you avoid research extractivism? So
Mhm.
and this is all about engagement. I've seen actually brown people work in a way that is extremely
Mhm.
problematic and extremely I've seen Iraqis too themselves do
Mhm.
research. It's not sufficient to be from the place actually, and it
Mhm.
can be as problematic, right? However, and you can be not from the place, but really think about ethics and politicize
Mhm.
ethics, right? This
Mhm.
idea of research ethics, for example, you politicize it. You understand the power relation that exists between you and what you want to write about, right? You clarify it, you have a kind of a transparent self-reflection on it, you
Mhm.
address it as much as you can, and you engage. It
Mhm.
really depends on how you engage with
Mhm.
the place, with the people that you work on.
Mhm.
And there's no perfect positionality.
Mhm.
There's no perfect positionality. Everything
And
is always problematic.
have
There's
you seen
no
that recent article which talks about, positionality as actually a colonial device?
yeah,
I'm not sure. It was very widely circulated, but it's not just enough to say this is my positionality, as
yes,
if as if it absolves you from
absolutely.
every.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And but also, I mean, so you reflect on it, effectively it's not sufficient. But
mhm.
it's actually rare. I think only people of color are very that it's very interesting because if you look at like how research is nowadays. Like only us, we are
Wow.
very transparent and we say it all, and other people don't even do that, right? So it's a good first step. But then also it's important, there's no authentic research, or there's no authentic, nothing is, and this is where transnationalism is important to me, because we live in one world after all. And that this world has already been defined by histories of imperialism, right? So this world is already global and already connected. But it's how you understand this connection, how you problematize it, how you politicize it, and how you understand how you position yourself within these systems of power, right? And how you can help, for example, me being in the US, I managed to get a lot of funding, right? I'm positioned in a place where I can get resources, right? So how do I make sure that I use these resources in a way that is ethical, that can challenge the power relation existing between me, somebody based in the US, now tenured in a US institution, public institution, it's not an Ivy League, however, that has a symbolic power because of just being situated in this settler colony that is the US, in the heart of the empire. Of course, there is a power relation existing between me and a scholar in Baghdad University. So how with this awareness, what do I do to address this power relation? I mean, it's always about, basically, we know that we don't live in the world that we agree with. Like we know that we would want to live in a world that is more just, that, that where everybody can enjoy good infrastructures and services, where everybody can enjoy a good life. So we know we don't live in that world, but we don't want to be also idealistic to a point that we're not connected with the realities, right? And so it's also good to gain power, to take the power when we can take it, and apply our good politics, right, to this, powerful position that we can, I'm not against, taking more space. I'm more, into what do you do once you have, that place of privilege, right? What do you do with this privilege until, in the meantime, that we build the world in which we live in, because it's not going to happen in a day, right?
Thank you, Zahra. The last question I want to ask you. I've seen that, having dialogues with many categories of, people, whether they are activists, academics, artists, even, have always been a center of your work, from, Feminism Islamic that you edited in 2012 to this new research project you were just mentioning. Can you tell us more about your research project and what you are aiming to realize, to achieve with it, and how does it help you and help us and reach us in reimagining feminist ethics, feminist knowledge, and also new visions of the world, and how we can cohabit, how we can cohabit in it.
So my actually critical studies of Iraq initiative is really, I mean, it's kind of, for me, this project is really applying all the ideas that have been, writing about for a decade now to something very concrete. So, it's easy to write about like decolonizing theory, but then how do you actually put it in practice? And so the idea is so I work with a team of Iraqi scholars and activists and feminists, and we ask ourselves this question. So what does it mean to theorize from Iraq and not on Iraq, right? What does it mean to take Iraq as a framework to rethink the social sciences and to rethink feminist theory? And we think it in very concrete ways. So we don't think that Iraq is that the moon, like we think that it's actually embedded within, the world in which we live in. But it's also it's a hopeful research imaginary, because what we're trying to think is also, yes, our infrastructures have been destroyed. The education system in Iraq is a disaster, right? As a result of US invasion, the sanctions, as a result of a lot of things. But so, okay, But how can we turn this less, the fact that, you know, Iraqi scholars have this feeling that they always have to catch up, right? So they have to catch up with all the work that has been produced in US and UK universities about Iraq, actually. Always, it's a form of really epistemic violence, because they are required to actually read what is produced
And
in
cite them.
inside them and
When the
engage with it.
reciprocity is not, you know.
And otherwise they're not, you know, their work is not considered theoretical enough. And also it's crazy because US and UK scholars don't even translate the work that they,
Yes.
you know, so they have to do the work of trying to understand that work and cite it to understand their own context in society. It is crazy when you think about it, but this is what research is. Maybe you're familiar with, you know, Amina Mama and her seminal article, when she says, is it ethical
Ethical to research.
research Africa? Like, what the hell is this research about? Because it is produced in a global academy that is so structurally, politically unequal and uneven. It is not global. It is English dominated. It is white middle class dominated. So what we're trying to think is, okay, so some of us still want to exist in this world. I mean, this is the whole thing about the whole debates of politics of representation. I mean, also you want to be a scholar that could, you are in Baghdad University, but you still want your work to be coded by other people. So it's kind of, you know, the difficulty dealing with the reality of it. So you're going to use certain strategy and write in a certain way that fits. What is the language of academia? It is the language of white masculine rationality, right? Exactly. The connection with emotion. So you're going to play the game.
So-called objective.
And we have all played the game. You have played the game. I have played the game just to get in, right? So the difference is that we are aware. We haven't lost track of the fact that we are playing this game. So we know it is a game, right? We know that theory can be something very different. So we are trying to play the game and make the scholarship actually made. I break with the term knowledge production, and I introduce the term knowledge making. So we're trying to kind of, you know, like place this knowledge in the map of what this stupid global academy is. And at the same time, and this is the most challenging kind of aspect of our work, it is, we also understand that actually theory, I mean, if we want to define theory, is to make sense of.
Yes.
To theorize is to make sense of your world, is to make sense of your life. So actually theory in Iraq, the most theoretical body of scholarship that we have is actually through poetry. Like, actually the political thinking, the intellectual thinking of Iraqis has always expressed itself through poetry. It has actually, if you look at scholarship work, it's mostly a copy paste or a bad photocopy of of American academia, or like, you know, Western academic work, and it's not so good. It doesn't express much. You can understand Iraq if you understand, you know, Iraqi poetry. So how do we then theorize and promote forms of theory and of being theoretical that is poetic, right? That centers the poetic, that centers also, that doesn't break with emotion, that doesn't break with, you know, subjective experience, right? So how, and this is kind of the tough part, but we're trying to do that at the same time.
And you say it so beautifully. I am just wanting to read what you are going to produce and your next book. I'm really so looking forward to it. And I think what you just said maybe is not just specific for Iraq.
Yeah,
when
of
I
course.
think about, you know, Palestine, the poetry of, you know, Refat Alarir. When I think about even Senegal, the tales. So I think it's really important what you just said. We need to really try to make this knowledge based on what we know best, you know, what our imagination, what our world is made of, and trying to evade Western forms of knowing and Western forms of maybe doing. So thank you so much for this. I think this is really,
Thank you.
it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Such a pleasure as well.
I really look forward to discussing your next book with you.
Inshallah, me too.
Thank you so much. So